The verse at the end of the 6th Aliyah in the Torah reads as follows: Vayivi'eha Yitzchak ha'ehela Sarah imo. Isaac brought Rebekah into the tent of his mother Sarah. Vayikach et Rivka, and he married Rebekah. Vatihi lo leisha, and she became his wife. Vayahaveha, and he loved her. What was it that happened inside Sarah's tent that made Isaac decide to marry Rebekah? I know what your minds might be thinking, but that's not what the tradition says. The Aramaic translation of the text, it's called Targum Onkelos, says that when Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother's tent, he noticed that she was doing the same things that his mother was doing. It was her actions, her behavior, that made an impression upon him. But Rabbi Yitzchak Dov Soloveitchik is known as the Brisker Rav. He asks an interesting question on this explanation for Isaac's marriage, because he calls our attention to a different story from the Midrash about what happened when Rebekah was brought into Sarah's tent. The Midrash teaches that in Sarah's tent there were miracles that were constant. The cloud, there was a special cloud of glory that hung out above her tent. Her dough always rose perfectly. So not huge miracles, but miracles nonetheless. And there was a light that remained on in her tent from Friday to Friday. When Sarah dies, all these miracles cease. But when Rebekah is brought into Sarah's tent, the Midrash says, they returned. So the Brisker Rav says, why wasn't that enough proof for Isaac to convince him that he ought to marry Rebekah? All these miracles return. What better proof do you need than that? Why did he need also to observe her behavior, to be convinced by her behavior? So the Brisker Rav says something very important and interesting. He says those miracles returning meant nothing to Isaac. He didn't want to know what God thought about Rebekah. He didn't care about how the environment reacted to her. He didn't want to know what anything or anybody else would do for her. He needed to see her commitment with his own eyes. He wanted to see what she would do herself. Only when he saw her observing and practicing what his own mother had done did he agree to marry her. And even today, doesn't it all come down to what we do for ourselves, to what we decide to observe, what we decide to do? Remember, Isaac wasn't just looking for a bride. He was looking for Jewish continuity. Jewish continuity is not dependent on the environment around us, even if they involve miracles by the hands of heaven. It is all about our choices, what we do. It seems obvious, but actually we don't often hear this most basic truth in today's Jewish discourse. When it comes to the alarming rates of disaffiliation and assimilation in our Jewish community, we've developed a bit of a defeatist attitude, saying that our decline isn't because of our choices, it's because of the environment. It is just an inevitable consequence of the free, open, and accepting Canada that we call home. The claim is not without merit. Assimilation is part of our story. Actually, it is part of our story that we share with many other European immigrants to these shores. Gerbert Gans has written recently about terminal ethnic identity among whites of European background. He basically says that by now, many of us are fourth and fifth generation Canadians, and our connections to the culture of our immigrant forebears is tenuous, if not gone already. But there is also a uniquely Jewish element to our assimilatory experience in North America, and we ought to be conscious of the enormous environmental transformations that have both helped and hurt our cause just in the past 70 years. Many of you remember civic life in the middle of the 20th century. You can attest to a culture that was much more hospitable to Jewish life than it is today. At that time, even Jews who may not have had much interest in religion experienced sufficient social pressure to join synagogues in order to keep up with their neighbors going to churches. How matters have changed today. Today, elite culture is hostile to religion. Churchgoers are viewed with suspicion, and religious liberty is taken for granted by politicians, by academics, and in the legal, technological, and entertainment worlds that have come to compose our culture. Keeping up with the Joneses today means devaluing religion, where it once meant the opposite. There was also a revival of ethnic Jewish pride in the late 60s and early 70s. American Jews who had been previously timid about displaying their Jewishness proudly started wearing kippot and stars of David, publicly demonstrating support for Israel and for Soviet Jewry. How times have changed. Today's multiculturalism is viciously hostile to Israel. The great debate about ethnicity among today's Jews does not focus on the best ways to enrich Jewish culture, but whether Jews are a real minority or not. In 2 generations, Jews have gone from being the remnant of the most horrific genocide in human history to being labeled as privileged oppressors, and pathetically, many Jews swallow this nonsense. Thus, in the past 70 years, the wider culture, our environment, first encouraged religious participation, then dismissed it. Jewish ethnic pride was first strongly validated and then severely contested. Support for Israel was first strengthened and then weakened. No wonder many say, our rates of assimilation have become so dramatic. So many challenges exist outside of our tent. But even inside the tent, things aren't so great. We have developed inside the Jewish community many unhelpful internal policies that also, I believe, threaten our survival. These are advanced by those who think they are strengthening Jewish life, but I think they are helping, in fact, to destroy it. In the area of philanthropy, for example, Jews are giving less and less to particularly Jewish causes and particularly Jewish needs. We should not be blessing this type of defection by labeling it as tikkun olam. The Jewish people today are literally in danger of disappearing. That is the reality. The very culture that helped many of these millionaires to become successful in the first place. Universities should not be charitable priorities for Jews right now. Among those who do give generously to Jewish causes, priorities are often misguided. Many, for example, direct most of their giving to Israeli institutions, but turn a blind eye to domestic Jewish needs. Who do funders imagine will succeed them as staunch Zionists if the next generation right here in Toronto has no Jewish education because it's become unaffordable? Decades of research has demonstrated the effectiveness of formal Jewish education coupled with informal experiential Jewish programs in shaping identification with Judaism and the Jewish people. If we want a real birthright for North American Jews, we ought to make it a rich Jewish education. The same is true of synagogues. Major funders and federations reward hundreds of thousands of dollars to so-called emergent Jewish communities while not giving a penny to shuls that are struggling financially. Who do you think is doing most of the work in North America today of religious renewal? It's shuls. We may have long histories and traditions, but we are no less open to innovation than anybody else. Yet rarely do we receive a dime from leading funders. Our current obsession with novelty and disruption impedes support for the very institutions still serving and still attracting the large majority of Jews who are still involved in Jewish life today. Strong synagogues and schools are the only hope we have to fix the crucial failure of North American Judaism, and that is the wide-scale Jewish cultural and Hebrew illiteracy of our community. It is not only that most Jews don't understand the Hebrew language of the Siddur. More and more Jews I meet don't even understand the difference between Aleph and Bet. What is our currently favored solution to this problem? To offer prayer books in transliteration. At least they'll help everybody to sing along. But you all know that it will not help Jews become more knowledgeable and will not help Jews become more committed. Inside the tent and outside the tent, the environment is hostile. But here's the thing. Isaac did not care. He didn't care about the environment. He knew what I'm submitting today in these remarks, and that is that no matter what is going on around us, we always have the ability to choose. Always have the ability to decide for ourselves. Until Rivka started doing and practicing, Isaac was not satisfied. If our community exists in 2 generations from now, it will be because we have retained solid religious convictions and because we are living disciplined Jewish lives. Full stop. I agree wholeheartedly with my professor, the noted Jewish sociologist Jack Wertheimer, who wrote, I quote, "Aside from anti-Semitic persecution, nothing is likely to play a larger role in determining the future of Jewish life in this country than the lived religion of ordinary Jews." End quote. The all too often overlooked elements when we speak of assimilation are the choices American and Canadian Jews have made. The poor choices American and Canadian Jews have made. The poor choices Jewish leaders have made. We pursue easy fixes for short-term gain rather than more difficult projects that might help with our long-term survival. We choose to dumb down Jewish life instead of enriching it. We choose to make decisions based on survey data instead of on the Torah. And the most consequential choice of all is who we are deciding to marry. Intermarriage is both the main cause and the most significant symptom of the decline of Jewish life in North America today. I don't mean to insult anybody by saying that. It is simply the fact. You would have to be delusional to think otherwise. If we wanted to speed up Judaism's decline, the best thing we would do would be to normalize intermarriage in our synagogue and in our community institutions. I know that in the past few weeks, focus groups composed of Beth Tikva members have been meeting to think about our future. They are thinking about how our synagogue environment can be better, and I think that's wonderful. We need help from members in thinking about how our shul can be better. But I challenge our members to remember the lesson of the Brisker Rav. Our environment, whether it's the shul or wider society, influences but does not determine the quality and commitment of our own Jewish lives. Let's look at the shul. Let's look at its programming. But don't forget to look at yourselves and how we can improve as Jews as well. I love this congregation and I love our members, but when it comes to the strength of our convictions and the depths of our observance, we have been heading in the wrong direction for way too long. I accept accountability for the synagogue's failures, but I do not accept accountability for the poor decisions people have made. I would not give this sermon today if I did not believe that we could do better. I would not give it if I felt we were headed towards inevitable decline and disappearance. In this game of survival, there are no shortcuts. Since the time of the patriarchs and matriarchs, convictions and a disciplined Jewish life have proven to be the essential ingredients for continuity. That is not a conservative mentality. It is not an orthodox mentality. It is normatively Jewish and historically validated, and I firmly believe that it is the only way for us to get back on track. If pursued, we will have a chance to refill our empty tents, rebuild what was once upon a time a confident North American Jewry, and flourish on these shores for generations to come. Shabbat Shalom.